For joining me here this Friday afternoon. I am going to ask you please to keep your microphones muted so that there's no background noise, unless, of course, you want to speak, in which case you're only too welcome to speak. I just want to be very clear that I can be heard. Can just one person unmute your microphone and tell me that you can hear me clearly?
Perfectly.
Fantastic. Thank
Perfectly.
you. Thank you so much. All right. So let's begin. My name is Ivor Blumenthal, and I wanted to have this webinar to address the realities of what is currently facing the small business community, and particularly that part of the small business community that have been identified as the non-priority areas. And I will talk about that a little later. And I use that term advisedly because obviously government is not saying that these are not important industries and that, or sectors, but what they are saying is that in terms of COVID and the current problem, they are also the ground zero industries and sectors that cannot be controlled in an environment where there are only so many resources and so much tax money and people power, and particularly healthcare workers, to be able to deal with problems as and when they arise. So I want to start off by saying that we have to understand the predicament our government is in, as every government around the world is in, and the message that they're giving to essentially the hospitality sector to say, we have so much to do. You guys just cannot be our priority as a government any longer. Now, having said that, tomorrow at 10 o'clock, Saturday morning at 10 o'clock, there will be an announcement by the Minister of Trade and Industry specifically on the schedule of industries that are positively affected by the level 4 announcement last night. And those industries then that will be phased in over time, but really, quite frankly, will relate to the other level ratings. So I do want to ask you please to listen tomorrow at 10 o'clock, because you will then definitively know whether aspects, for example, of the restaurant industry, for example, hot food retailing as one example, for example, possibility of takeaways as another example, canteens as another example, whether there is any possibility that those might be exceptions which the Minister of Trade and Industry is prepared to make when he has to weigh up health on the one hand and economic health on the other hand, particularly companies and jobs which might be available. It is an art. It is not a science. Our government at the moment are the artists in the process. There are some good artists, and there are also some people who, quite frankly, have not got into pre-grade yet as ministers. We know who they are. We have to live with it. It's the reality of our current condition. So we're here today to talk about small businesses in distress, and thank you for joining me. My name is Ivor Blumenthal, and I'm calling this the forum, for want of a better word. We're calling this the forum. So let us start, please, ladies and gentlemen, with this, and that is that irrespective of all of the other announcements yesterday, irrespective of the 5 levels, and we will talk in detail of the 5 levels, and irrespective also of the fact that while we have a national level 4 that has been announced effective from the 2nd of May, the reality is that every single province is going to come back with a different alert level, and that different alert level is going to impose different conditions on businesses that we will have to deal with once we know what those alert levels are. What is critically important is that in the risk-adjusted strategy review document that the president relied on, he did say that I am expecting business associations to come to me with proposals. Now, I know that, for example, the Restaurant Association are hard at work in putting together proposals. I've seen all of the messaging and all the emails and the WhatsApps this morning. So the reality is it's very likely that the restaurant industry is going with a rescue plan to the Minister of Trade and Industry. Unfortunately, the Minister of Trade and Industry will have to refer that plan to the Ministry of Tourism and Hospitality. And we know, because of the last 2 weeks of what's happened with the release of the 50,000 Rand per business opportunity, we know that the Ministry of Tourism and Hospitality will most probably mess up the distribution of that plan, but most probably be better controlled by the intergovernmental department which now exists, which operates across Department of Finance, Treasury, then Department of Trade and Industry, and then the functional department, which in this instance will be tourism and hospitality. So my inclination, my feeling is that when it comes to restaurants, government, the powers that be in government under the presidency are just not going to let divisional ministers mess up the opportunity to get it right this time, whereas they did get it so completely wrong over the last 2 weeks with the last incentive program that was released. However, irrespective of what the national rating is and what the provincial rating is, the fact is that these are the target industries for last relief, if I can put it that way. And so sit-in restaurants and hotels for obvious reasons, because the virus spreads from person to person, and the virus spreads where there are crowds of people, where there are large groupings of people. And so therefore, saying that restaurants and hotels will quite frankly be the last group to be allowed back to be released back into civil society is understandable. Not from your perspective if you happen to be a restaurant or a hotel or a bar or a shebeen, but certainly from the point of view of the rest of the population. There's no question about that. Conference and convention centers. Well, those conference and convention centers, unfortunately, equally are large crowd conference and convention centers, and therefore will be the last to be released, including cinemas, theaters, concerts, sporting events. Unfortunately, as well, the reality is that the non-governmental organization sector, and particularly churches, synagogues, mosques, community centers, have all been relegated to the least priority category of all of the industries, which will be reintroduced into civil society as a result of the release on the lockdown. I will a little later be talking about a projected time frame. And again, it's an art, not a science. What's very important is this particular observation. No gatherings of more than 10 people outside of a workplace will be permitted. Conventional wisdom amongst those people who've been commentating on this slide this morning have said that that means that if a restaurant is classified as a workplace, then in fact the previous number of 50 will apply. There is a school of thought that says that this number of 10 has been introduced to equally apply in places where there are gatherings of people generally, such as, for example, in restaurants, hotels, bars, shebeens, etc. There is clarification that has been sought from the ministry, and we understand it will be forthcoming in gazettes. I am going to ask you to do this. If you could please WhatsApp me on, I'll give you the number at the end, but if you could please WhatsApp me on a number that I will give you at the end with one word, which is small, SMALL, then what I will do is we'll be creating a WhatsApp group specifically for businesses that are considering themselves to be in distress because of these regulations, so that whenever new government gazettes are published or new guidelines are published by any ministry that affect the small business sector in particular, we will get those to you as a particular interest group. So I'm going to give you the number a little later. Just for interest sake, it is my WhatsApp number, 082 880 5316. 082 880 5316. Please feel free to WhatsApp me on that number so that we are able to in fact, keep you informed specifically for purposes of the effect on your businesses of all of the incentive programs which might be introduced, or in fact, any of the clarifications. And short term, ladies and gentlemen, I need to disabuse you of something. Short term, the news is not likely to be good for small businesses, which are people contact businesses, as opposed to professional service businesses. So any business which provides a service which is based on people contact is going to be a business under the COSH. I have started to believe under the COSH for as long as most probably September, October, November, most probably November, where the understanding is that you might get into the December, January trade, but expect a significant reduction in your income for that December, January trade. The reason I'm raising this is that in your engagement with your landlords, with your creditors, with your bankers, even with your insurance companies, you need to be referring to this fact that the likelihood is that because you're a people contact business, particularly those of you who are depending on densifications beyond 5 or 10 people, that the likelihood is that you're only going to be back into half tilt by the December-January business period, and that you will really only be in a position to look at some kind of recovery in the first quarter of next year. And I'm not trying to be the sword of Damocles, but simply trying to be practical for you and with you in this discussion. If you've got any comments, please feel free to raise them. And equally, you can raise them in the chat facility that some of you have already been using. Okay, so moving on. So we've just come out of the level 5 alert where only essential services were in fact allowed to operate. One of the things you need to consider, irrespective of what level of alert we're talking about, is this component over here called movement restrictions. Because if miraculously tomorrow you find out that you are one of the industries or one of the subsectors of an industry that are going to be allowed to open up in some form or another, you need to consider where your staff are coming from. You also need to consider where your product is coming from and your supply chain is dependent on. Because if there is anything which is interprovincial, you're going to have a problem in terms of the movement, unless you have a permit for interprovincial movement of people or interprovincial movement of product. So we've just come out of level 5, as you know, and we are now in level 4. Equally so in terms of movement restrictions, please understand, no interprovincial movement of people except for transportation of goods where you have a permit for interprovincial transportation of goods. Now, what's critically important to understand here is that there is absolutely nothing here which relates to any kind of trading outside of the existing trading that has been permitted under the last month of lockdown. So level 4 basically is saying that whereas we were level 5 with exceptions in April, in May we are going to be level 4 validating all the exceptions of April. However, we are informed that the interministerial tasks team tomorrow morning through the Minister of Trade and Industry will be announcing classifications of industries which might again break the mold as it's indicated on sectors permitted under level 4, moderate to high virus spread with moderate readiness. So the bottom line is that we cannot say definitively whether any industry is in or out for the next month or so until we hear what the classification of industries is going to be tomorrow. And once we hear that, I want to break it down and send a memo to all of those people on our various WhatsApp groups in terms of how to interpret. The reality is that they will, I'm just going to mute everyone's microphone. The reality is that they will most probably continue with essential service permits for essential service businesses in that classification, and most probably extend the business portal permit classification application process to non-essential businesses which have been declassified and therefore are able to be reversed back into the economy. I do want to put up one red flag here, however, and that is this. You might be declassified. In other words, you might be allowed to start trading from the 2nd of May. And yet your dependencies on industries and supply chains which have not been declassified, have not been released back into the economy, is such that you might choose to remain under lockdown. The jury is out whether a voluntary choice in that regard would therefore classify you for UIF TER funding for your staff who remain on temporary layoff. So conventional wisdom says that the UIF TER should continue and be available to you as a subsidy for your payroll costs should you still be operating or still choose to operate down the line. However, there is no clarification on that yet. And so we cannot say that if you are an industry that has been released but choose to remain on voluntary lockdown, whether or not the UIF lockdown benefit will still apply to you or not. It is too early to tell, but it is certainly something that you need to to watch out for. Dominique Jones has just said, confirming 10 a.m. tomorrow for announcements. Yes, 10 o'clock tomorrow morning for announcements, Dominique. Okay, moving on. Now, a lot of what you would ordinarily expect small business, or where you would ordinarily expect small businesses to be located, would be from level 3 upwards, including, by the way, liquor retail with restricted hours, takeaway restaurants and online food delivery, etc. However, we are not at a level 3, and more importantly, there is a very strong chance that there are some provinces, specifically Gauteng, KZN, and the Western Cape, that in fact might still be classified at level 5s because of their numbers. Now, it is very likely that the Minister of Trade and Industry will choose from these level 3 sectors which are permitted to basically validate them as exceptions for the sectors permitted under level 4. So in other words, that the minister will fetch from the level 3 categories of sectors permitted and incorporate them now under the level 4, just like was done under the level 5, where he went and he fetched some level 3 and some level 4 industries and classified them as essential services. I'll give you a practical example. Under level 3 is classified hardware stores. Well, the hardware stores have been permitted to actually operate under level 5 alert readiness classification, only for the purpose of providing essential service businesses with hardware that they were going to need. For example, geysers, for example, electrical installations, fixing up machinery and equipment, etc., etc. So it will be very interesting. Globally, what has tended to happen is that nurseries, believe it or not, and hardware stores have been declassified earlier because of the conventional wisdom that says if people have to stay at home, let them at least do some gardening and let them do, all the odds and ends around the house, and they're going to need hardware product for that purpose. So that is the thinking there. So to fetch from level 3. Good. All right, let's move on to level 2. Level 2 becomes, let's call it the normalization with a certain amount of conviction to try and reduce the spread of the virus. But level 2 is where we've got, for example, even the construction sector, all retail, all manufacturing, all government services, domestic workers and cleaners coming back into the system, but only at level 2. We are, at the moment, I'm going to re-emphasize, at the moment we're at level 4. So we are 2 levels away from level 2. I just want to very quickly, there are some people, and as late as an hour before we got on air now, still asking me the question, why did they choose restaurants? We don't understand. We're careful. We ask people to wash their hands, to wear masks. But, if 10 people are in, or 50 people are in a restaurant doing that and there's social distancing, why us? Well, it's really about what governments are trying to promote from a healthcare perspective, which is an asymptomatic solution for South Africa. They realize that people are going to contract the virus. People still carry MERS with them. They carry SARS with them. Viruses spread, and every single virus season, viruses get stronger and viruses come back. But what government is trying to promote is the asymptomatic contracting of the virus, which means I have the virus, but it's not going to affect me. It's not going to make me sick. It's not going to kill me. And so government have consciously planned that what they call the herd mingling, the mingling of one community with another community should not take place at level 4, but in fact should only start taking place from level 3 onwards. And the best example I could use is with domestic workers. Domestic workers who've gone home to a different province are now in a different herd to the herd you and your family are in. When they come back into your home environment, immediately those 2 herds will start mingling again. And what government is saying is they don't want to do that in such a way or at such a time that if people do get sick because of that mingling, they don't have the health facilities, they don't have the beds, they don't have the quarantine facilities to be able to cope with that kind of pandemic result. Bearing in mind, 50,000 people are now dead in America. Bearing in mind, tens of thousands of people are now dead in the United Kingdom because those countries didn't choose to go the route we went. Now, what our government is trying to avoid is saying that even though we managed to flatten the curve, if we release these herds to mingle too quickly, we might very well see a spike in the curve. And if you see a spike in an African country, that spike is not going to be 10,000 or 20 or 50,000, but it's likely to be 300,000 dead people. And that's what our government is trying to avoid here by saying our classification at this stage is a classification which is at a level that we can control. It's at level 4, and in some provinces, it might even be at a level 5 once the provinces start declaring their levels. And really, the mingling should only take place from 3 to 2 to 1. All right. I spoke about this yesterday as well, so I'm not going to belabor the point. I'm just going to say, let me answer Leah's question. Are taxis at 70% not more risky than restaurants, conference, etc.? They can be very cautious with social distancing and all other measures. Leah, our Minister of Transport has made a mockery of social distancing because he has no power base with the taxi fraternity in South Africa. You cannot look at the taxi industry as a regular industry which is being regularly managed or controlled. This country, unfortunately, is run by the taxi industries, and government are powerless to do anything about taxis. So in answer to your question, there is no question that the majority of the spread that is taking place at the moment amongst the untested component of civil society. Remember, we have 58 million people in the country, only 200,000, in fact, only 160,000. But let's give it the benefit of the doubt and say only 200,000 have been tested. The vast majority of those people who have been tested do not catch these taxis. So as a result, we have no idea knowing what the incidents are in the herds which are dependent on public transport in South Africa. You cannot look at the taxi industry and compare yourself to the taxi industry because you do not have the same power with government to literally make one phone call and get them to reverse every piece of legislation that they've put into play. If you activated, if you start playing forcefully, if you were to threaten people physically as the taxi industry does, including threaten ministers, etc., you might have a different dispensation for the restaurant sector. But you're part of civil society, not uncivil society. So as a result, you have a no power base in that regard. So in answer to your question, no, it's not respected in taxis, but you have to ignore that as a reality. All right. I'm sorry to sound as blasé as I have been in my answer, but there's no other way of describing it. Dominic says, does anyone know where the beauty industry fits in? Well, Dominic, look, number one, we'll hear about classification tomorrow. Number two, you could be naive enough to think that beauty industry is classified as personal services, and I'll talk about that in a second, but it's not. Beauty industry, unfortunately, slots straight into these classifications here, but has not been specified. It doesn't slot into general retail. There is no SIC code or SOC code classification for personal care services that there should be at this moment in time. So as a result, we'll hear tomorrow where it resides, but you can be certain that, don't let me say that you can be certain because anything can happen tomorrow. But ordinarily, if we follow the current trajectory of talk, you can be certain that it won't be declassified anytime soon. Unless there is a lobby, unless there is a management process which is suggested to the Department of Trade and Industry, unless the Department of Trade and Industry decide to champion the cause of the beauty and the hairdressing sector, as opposed to handing it over to health, because the moment it's handed over to health, it'll be dead in the water. But if DTI retain it as a small business concern, and are properly lobbied on behalf of the beauty, health and skincare industry and the hairdressing sector, there is a chance that DTI would be convinced to make exceptions with very, very particular standard operating procedures. However, understand the risk they would be asked to be taking here. So it would really only ever be an economic decision, not a health decision. Unfortunately, I have to say that to you. Okay, so let's get to it. So unfortunately, we are most probably about I'd say a good 3 to 4, maybe even 5 working days away from what is currently a national level 4 being classified on a provincial basis by provincial governments. If you consider that the Western Cape, KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng are the hotbeds at the moment of infections and deaths around the country, only because that's where the majority of testing is taking place. But if you consider that on the basis of the current statistics, those are the hotbeds, it is likely that those provinces will at least remain level 4. But if they're going to be true to the science, will most probably be elevated to level 5 and back into lockdown again. And I'm sorry to be the bearer of such bad news, but that's how this particular theory will work, how this particular classification methodology would work. For political reasons, however, it is unlikely that there will be level 5 reclassification of any province, irrespective of what the science says. And therefore, it is highly unlikely that Gauteng, KZN, and the Western Cape will be classified at anything other than a level 4 to keep with the national classification. However, all of the other provinces will most probably be classified between level 3 and level 4, maybe at a push even level 2. Although that will be extremely disingenuous and might cause some kind of a rebuke from the World Health Organization, because that is fanciful and really only related to the fact that we have only seen 200 out of 58,200,000 tests having been completed so far. I want to say what I said yesterday as well, and that is this. Understand, it's not the number of tests which are carried out there in the marketplace which are the issue. It is the number of those tests that can be processed. We have very limited processing facilities in this country. And even though we've tried to buy more and more processing machinery and equipment into the country, it's been very difficult because the whole world wants that equipment. And South Africa is certainly not a priority state. So we are getting the equipment, but at a very slow rate, I just need to add. What you do have to understand is that this document makes reference to the fact that government would like to see more and more industry associations taking the responsibility for facilitating testing, and large companies or large chain groups taking the responsibility for testing of staff members and even customers and clients. That, unfortunately, has fallen on deaf ears because there is a cost associated with it, but that cost can be recovered from the Department of Health via the Department of Trade and Industry if you were a business association wanting to offer that kind of service. Okay, now this is the important thing that you need to understand. Industries, 29 target industries. Not all industries, and beauty is not there, and health and skincare is not there, and hairdressing is not there. Because they aren't classified under professional services and they're not classified under any of the other categories. But these 29 target industries have been classified on a scale of essentially risk. And if government were to take a sectoral approach to lifting the lockdown, they would say, right, we need to take economic value of the business to the country as a whole. We would need to take the transmission risk that I've just spoken about into account. And then we'd need to take the economic stress of what happens if the businesses collapse and the people are out of work. And those three factors together would cause us to determine which are the priority industries which should be released back into civil society. These ratings over here, from number 2 to number 18, are ratings of a 9-point scale which only relate to health. They don't relate to the economy. So they only relate to factor number 2, which is the transmission risk. And so this is a factor of transmission risk, all the way from the automotive sector at low transmission through to international and local flying and aviation and transport at the highest rating. And so what you need to know is that industries are going to be released back into civil society from the bottom up, with the lowest ratings all the way through to the higher ratings. And what you have to understand when you make a decision, do I open or not open again, is even if I'm in the bottom half of this particular group of 29 industries, what are my dependencies like in terms of where I get my product from and who I sell my services to on a business-to-business basis? And if those, my supply chain and my customers, are in the top part of this particular group of 29, then it might not be worth my while even to open again until everybody is released back into the economy. So you please need to understand that. But again, making a decision as to which industries to release will be based on risk of transmission, which is that 2 to 18 factor, then the impact on the sector and the country as a whole on continued lockdown, and then the value of that sector to the country as a whole in terms of continued lockdown. Number two is very much about the Department of Trade and Industry saying, if we lose all of the restaurant businesses because of this lockdown, 100,000, 200,000, 1 million people will be out of work. We can't afford that as a country. So if restaurants could be, let's say, between 9 and 12 in terms of that previous rating, then maybe we would release those restaurants back into civil society because of what we stand to lose if we don't economically. But that is unfortunately what the government have to be considering at this moment in time. Now, this is not an official government document. This is me blue sky. This is me doing the Daniel Silk thing based absolutely on no fact or foundation whatsoever. But I've said here, if you were to ask what is a possible trajectory, which has to remain provincially sensitive, because remember, if we have a trajectory in the country as a whole based on a level 4, but a province classifies itself as a level 5, then this trajectory will be off. But basically, we're saying on the basis of the current talk, lockdown for May and possibly June for those companies and industries which are not included in the classification. If we're talking about the restaurant industry, takeaway release for June or possibly August, except that we might very well find that takeaways are permitted from tomorrow under particular circumstances, because there's been a massive lobby on government from the essential services sector to say we're now working a full day in hospitals or as electricians or as plumbers, but we've got no Burger King to go to for lunch. We've got no Kentucky Fried Chicken to go to for supper. And by the time we try and buy something to take home and make, it's too late. So there's a massive lobby from the essential service group to have takeaways opened up. And quite frankly, it's obviously much easier for government to control takeaways than sit-down restaurants. If tomorrow takeaways are opened up, then when it comes to innovating your restaurant practice, at least you know you can take your product. As long as the Minister of Police doesn't stick his nose into it again and say, no hot product. But as long as he doesn't, then you know that you can basically convert your current product offering into takeaways, focus on packaging, focus on good courier servicing of those takeaways. And you have a very good, what a friend of mine calls a pivot into a more medium to long-term solution. But we'll know tomorrow. If we don't hear, if you do not hear tomorrow of an industry that has been declassified, you can expect anywhere from a 3-week to a 6-week lag before additional industries are added to those lists. Ordinarily, unless, of course, there's a cousin or a nephew of a particular minister who needs something done. All right, moving on. Extension of lockdown. There's no question that for companies and industries which have not been declassified, your lockdown is extended for July and August, particularly for sit-down and event businesses. Ordinarily, based on these rules from these scientists in the risk-adjusted strategy that we're talking about, if you're in personal care, that's beauty, nail, health and skincare, and hairdressing, you can accept that the likelihood is that you will not be allowed to trade through May, possibly June, and possibly July. That's the news for you, unfortunately. Unless, again, the exceptions are going to be made on economic and not health reasoning, which is quite possible. It's quite possible. It's trying to balance those balls. Certainly, we know at this moment in time that the number of people you can have in your businesses is never going to be more than 50. The possibility is they might, in some instances, in level 3 classified provinces, they might raise that from 50 to 100 if you're lucky, but there's nothing to substantiate that. And then the other possibility, unfortunately, is, hold on a moment, the only thing this document refers to in terms of numbers in gatherings is 10. So it's a scale of 10 to 50 and maybe 100. 10 being the lower end of the scale and 100 being the upper and the higher end of the scale. But just think about the health ramifications of anything more than 10. In other words, I'm asking you to think like a government minister. Think of the health ramifications of anything more than 10. Now, Peter has said something that's extremely interesting for the restaurant industry. He says this: as soon as a restaurant does takeaways, rental will kick in. Peter, you're right. The bottom line is now is the time for renegotiation. We'll talk about that a little later, I think. All right. We anticipate, ladies and gentlemen, that vaccination in the world will kick in anywhere from October to February. There are a couple of trials. In fact, South Africa is involved in the largest trial at the moment. But the reality is it's going to take anywhere from between 4 to 6 months for vaccinations to be released into the marketplace. And then obviously they have to be made by the pharmaceutical companies, which are gearing up and licking their lips at the moment. But the bottom line is we do not anticipate a full-blown vaccination program being released into the marketplace anywhere before October to February of next year. That's the likely trajectory for that. Now, remember, vaccinations are not going to cure the problem. Vaccinations are going to prevent people who are negative from becoming positive, and hopefully they're going to prevent people who have been positive but have been cleared and therefore remain negative from becoming positive again. So the likelihood is we're going to see a parallel health crisis. The one is, how do we trade out of those people who are infected? Or hopefully, how do we get them into an asymptomatic stage of infection where they're infected but they do not have symptoms, they're only passing on the infection? And then, on a parallel basis, how do we take people who are negative and vaccinate them against becoming infected? And that process is set to kick off if the vaccinations are approved from October. However, it might be that there's a major concession made by the World Health Authorities, not the World Health Organization, and that because of that, it might be that vaccinations are licensed before October, but highly unlikely. As far as restaurants are concerned, full trading as sit down, not earlier than November, possibly for the December trade, and then only at 30 to 55% of capacity. Remembering not only capacity, I can house between 30 and 50% of the people who ordinarily come into my business, but in terms of the political will of your customers to want to come back into your restaurant and sit at a table, knowing that the virus is still being spread out there. So there is a psychological barrier that you're going to have to figure out from a communication perspective, how to overcome with your customers to cause them to want to come in and enjoy your chops or your scallops or all of those things that everybody out there wants to see back on their plates. Nothing earlier than February, March next year for fixed rental talks with your landlord. And I'm going to emphasize this. Nothing earlier than February, March of next year for fixed rental talks with your landlords. So that brings us to leases now. Before I go into leases, let me just ask this. Any questions? Anybody want to make any statements or any considerations you want us to take into account? I will just quickly unmute your microphone just for purposes of you asking a question or making a statement. Okay, let's move on then. So leases. So some of you might be involved in our organization called CITA, the South African Independent Tenants Association. And there we are trying to deal with landlords on a landlord by landlord basis. But after yesterday's announcements, the kinds of things you're going to have to tender, offer to your landlord, that you're not going to get away with in terms of your lease, are your rates and your taxes. The only way you can get away with rates and taxes is if your landlord has managed to get the municipality to either waive, which is highly unlikely, or at least to defer, which is absolutely likely. So either to waive, which is to say, fine, we'll do away with rates and taxes, or to defer, which then means that you're going to owe it to us, but you'll pay us, once lockdown is over. If your landlord has made an approach to the municipality, there is 100% chance that they will have got deferment. So no landlord should come back to you and say we weren't able to get our rates and taxes deferred, which means that if a landlord is enforcing you to pay the rates and taxes, one of two things has happened. Number one, they've said to themselves, well, we're not even going to go to the municipality because maybe our rates and tax account is not in order because we've not been paying over to the municipality what we've been collecting from our tenants, which very often is going to be the case. Or we're not going to go to the municipality because the council will bill us. We'll collect from our tenants and we'll pay over to the council. Why should we have to bother with standing in queues to ask the council for favors? So one of those two things is happening. If your landlord is not telling you that he can defer your rates and taxes because the council has agreed to defer his rates and taxes. And I say again, I have not yet heard of a municipality that has turned around to a landlord and said, no, we are not giving you a deferment of rates and taxes. So if you are not getting your rates and taxes deferred and they're still billing you for those rates and taxes, it means that they haven't bothered to go to the municipality and ask for a deferment at least, but sometimes even a reduction. There are municipalities giving reductions, not just deferments of rates and taxes. Is there someone who wants to speak or say something? Yes, Dale?
No.
All right, sorry. Okay, fine. Now we come to the next area that you should be heavily, heavily involved with your landlord in negotiating. Your landlord is asking you to pay for the common area costs of the building you're in, asking you to pay proportionately for the common area, so for the fountain area, for the lifts, etc., etc., etc. Now the reality is, logic says that it should only be the companies that are trading in the center, i.e. essential service companies, that are having to pay common area costs. There is no case law on that because as tenants, you've never joined an association to force that case law or to at least force government to concede that case law. But logic dictates that if you do go to court and ask courts to decide, should we have to pay common area costs, the courts would say, in the time of lockdown, we understand that it should only be the companies trading that should have to pay those common area costs. Because you're already paying rates and taxes for the square meterage that you occupy in the building, why should you also have to pay common area costs when you're not even trading in the building during the time that those costs are being incurred? So that is an argument that collectively within a shopping center or individually you would want to take up with your landlord. Then it comes to insurance and security. So you're having to pay the insurance costs and the security costs of the building. Again, security most probably yes, because even if you're only using your store for storage purposes, it's very important that there's security in that building. But as far as insurance costs are concerned, when you have an insurance policy that declassifies or neutralizes force majeure, what is the value of that insurance policy? It's been a waste of money. So you're entitled to contest the notion of an insurance policy because ultimately you take out insurance anyway on the contents of your facility. And what are you paying rent for? You're paying rent to a property owner because they are selling you the use of a part of that building, and they should be bearing the responsibility for the insurance of that part of the building because otherwise they wouldn't be able to sell that space to you. So this whole argument about insurance, I think, is completely underrated, and you should consider contesting it. Now, as far as rent itself is concerned, some landlords, as you know, have very gracefully given you discounts, have said, we'll only charge you 50% of April, or in fact, some of them have said, we'll only charge you 0% of April. We'll give you 100% discount. Others have said, we'll give you 50% deferment. So pay us 50% of that rent, even though you're locked down and you have no income. Pay us 50% of the rent, and the other 50% will defer. You only have to pay us back from the 1st of July for 9 months or 6 months. Basically, the landlord saying, I'm prepared to wait for my money, but I still want my money, even though what I've sold you doesn't exist. And logically, that doesn't make sense. Now, I do need to say this. If you are a business that has signed and entered into your lease for your restaurant in your own name and not in a company's name, and if the value, the net asset value now of that restaurant is less than 2 million rand, then you are entitled to get out of that lease with 20 days notice and to negotiate on the penalties, which ordinarily would be in the region of about 10% of the outstanding lease amount, if you needed to get out of that lease. So I'm going to repeat that because it bears repeating. The Consumer Protection Act says this: if you have signed the lease in your own capacity, I, Ivor Blumenthal, rent this property from you, Melrose Arch, and the total net asset value of your business, not goodwill, the net asset value, my chairs, my tables, my machinery, my equipment, is less than 2 million rand, you are entitled to say, I'm canceling my lease in terms of the Consumer Protection Act. I'm giving you 20 days notice, and I am insisting on nothing more than 10% penalties that I have to pay here. Any question about that? Because that is quite an eye-opener for some people who didn't realize it. All right, moving on. There's a very good question.
All right, just quickly there.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, of course. Who is that?
That 10% penalty, it's Elton.
Hello, Elton.
Oh, thank you for taking the time to put this together.
Sure.
Just quickly, the 10% penalty applicable, is that on the balance of the lease or is that on a predetermined settlement value?
No, so there's no, there's nothing that says 10% is what your penalty should be. The conventional wisdom is that the consumer court, the consumer counsel in the court, have applied the notion of about 10% on average, where the parties themselves couldn't come to an agreement.
And would this be applicable during a crisis like COVID?
Well, it would, because, I mean, you're basically then going to be released from 90% of the balance of that lease, having to pay that 10%. But it's negotiable, you know. I mean, you could try and negotiate hard, and then if you didn't have anything to pay because of COVID, you could then ask the consumer court to decide. And the consumer court, in other words, you can go back to consumer counsel, say, we have a disagreement with our landlord, we can't come to terms, could you please decide? And they'll then come back and say, well, you know, you've got nothing in the bank, you haven't been trading, we understand you're out of business. The landlord, instead of 10%, we're going to force you to take 2% or 5%. So it is perfectly possible for that to happen. It's the subject of a negotiated settlement. When I say 10%, I'm just talking about the averages that are being applied out there as we speak. Now, very important. Yes, of course. Yes, please. Yes.
Sorry, if your premises is or your business is in a PTY limited, but there's a sole owner, and only one that person has signed personal guarantees.
No, so
will that imply? Well,
okay, so I have to answer that directly. So the bottom line is this: if the signatory to the agreement is a legal person, that is not you. So your company, your PTY Limited, has a legal personality. It is a legal person in its own right, irrespective of you also being there as a surety or a director. So in its own right, as a PTY Limited, it has its own legal personality. Legal personalities, which are commercial businesses, fall outside of the ambit of consumer protection, and they fall into the ambit of commercial law. And as a result, you therefore have to succumb to the terms of your lease for that reason, for cancellation. But there are other ways of cancelling. And you cannot be released from surety, because even if you've signed surety in your own right, you've signed on behalf of a legal person that is the subject of the contract. So I do need to emphasize that point. The other thing I want to say is this, ladies and gentlemen. Alison has asked the question, does the landlord have any right to tap into the rental deposits if we aren't able to pay? So Alison, the simple answer is possession is 9/10 of the law, which means that the landlord has taken your deposit. if you cannot come to an agreement with your landlord will simply keep your deposit and sue you for the balance. And it will then be for a court to decide on the basis of, if it's commercial law, it will be supervening impossibility, not force majeure. Now, some of you are going to tell me, for example, I've seen a high prop lease that says that high prop has in fact forced their tenants to sign a lease to say force majeure doesn't apply to us. It might be considered illegal for a landlord to have forced force majeure out of a contract. In other words, to say, irrespective of a pandemic or an act of God, you still have to pay the lease. That might be considered an illegal clause down the line if it is properly challenged by a collective of tenants who have never acted collectively before, but hopefully now with SITA, the South African Independent Tenants Association, might very well. So in answer to your question, what you are batting for, Alison, is that deposit. They know they can't get more money out of you under the current circumstances, but they can try and sue you in some way or another after lockdown. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, the benefit of your being locked down is for the purpose or for the period of lockdown, your landlord can't take legal action against you. There is an injunction on them taking legal action. All right. So that's also positive. That's a good thing. But eventually, your industry will be declassified and sent back into the trenches. And at that stage, your landlord might decide to sue you for losses in terms of the lease. I think you'll have a very, not just myself, but we think you'll have a very good argument to mitigate those losses. But nevertheless, you might find yourself having to defend against an action like that. Now, the bottom line is your landlord will have lien on your deposit. So, I mean, you need to go into this battle knowing that you're most probably not going to be reliant on your deposit being paid back to you anytime soon, if ever. You need to settle yourself with that fact, because that's the reality. Mike says now is the time to address the surety issue with the landlords. In other countries, this is not allowed. Well, Mike, that's exactly what we are trying to do as SITA. We are trying to get beyond just this emergency situation so that we can sit down with the Portfolio Committee on Trade and Industry in Parliament and say, we don't want sureties. We want shorter cancellation periods and possibilities. And at the end of the day, there are things like common areas that we don't necessarily want to have to pay for. So those regulations have to change. Those regulations have to be put in place. But it has to come from somewhere, in answer to your question, Mike. Peter says 10% cancellation fee on balance of number of months remaining. Well, it would be 10% of what could be expected over that balance period, Peter. All right, so that's the consumer protection. Cancellations, well, ladies and gentlemen, the only way you're going to get the law to be on your side is some kind of an action, which would be a class action, which is brought by a number of tenants, the more the cheaper, quite frankly, to determine the opportunity for cancellation and to automatically apply force majeure in the time of a pandemic. Because you're basically on your own, because many of you have signed a clause with your landlord to say force majeure won't apply. I don't know why you would have been advised to sign that clause. And I don't know why your landlords would have forced it on you. Well, we do know why they would have forced it on you, so that they could cover themselves in times like this. But as far as we're concerned, that's a criminal action, and your landlord should be criminally accountable for forcing you to sign a clause like that. Now, your biggest negotiation with your landlord is going to be around this issue, and that is this. Whereas your lease expects me to pay fixed rental, and I only pay a percentage of turnover over and above the fixed rental for the good months, I want to cancel my fixed rental with you, and I only want to offer you a percentage of turnover going forward, because that is splitting and sharing a risk. And the risk is, whatever business we do, I'm happy to pay you a percentage of that income in terms of rent. But if your center's not working, if COVID is not being reversed, and I'm not doing turnover, I don't want to be held to a fixed rental with you. So this is going to be an extremely difficult argument, but this is the argument, this is your battle that you have to be fighting here. SITA has taken this battle up. At the moment, we've acted on behalf of 280 small independent tenants. We've only been going for a week or so in this regard, but we've done 280 requests to the landlord. We've had no responses yet, because obviously the landlords are now in a panic, and especially after yesterday, they're in a panic. because their position has weakened dramatically. But we're forcing on the landlords the notion of a percentage of turnover to be reintroduced. We'd like to see law in the country that says it's the only way for small businesses, below 50 million rand. It's the only way for them to contract leases in the future. But we know we're going to get massive resistance from landlords about that particular factor. Yes, Kenny, the surety is your single biggest challenge. Unfortunately, you've signed surety, so it's a moot point as to whether or not we can invalidate your surety at this moment in time. All we can do is leases going into leases in the future, and hopefully renegotiating some of your existing leases. We can, descale your surety and maybe take it out completely. The next factor you have to consider, ladies and gentlemen, is this. As a small business, it's all very well. Let's say lockdown is lifted on the 2nd of May. It's all very well that your landlord gave you concessions for May, maybe even 100% discount off of your rental. However, the reality is this, that you need to plan for what we're calling a recovery period. Your landlord doesn't want to think about the recovery period, but you need to. And the recovery period says this: even if I can open my business on the 2nd of May, it is going to take a minimum of 6 months to a year for my business to get back to where I was in January, or better, in December last year. It's going to take a minimum of 6 months to a year. And because of that, I need to be able to negotiate with my landlord. I need somehow to be able to negotiate with my landlord that for that 6 months to that year period, I'm not going to pay fixed rental, but I want percentage turnover. So I'm sharing the risk. If my business picks up and does well, my percentage that I pay my landlord will be great. If it doesn't, I don't want to have to pay out of my own pocket or my own capital. Now, fortunately, your landlords have already started making offers to some of you where they have acknowledged the recovery period. So, for example, in the middle of April, they said to you, we'll give you 100% off for April of your rental and 50% off for May, which means they're already acknowledging that May will be recovery month and you won't be back to your full trading potential post-lockdown, which means the precedent has been set in that relationship with your landlord that you can now exploit and go back to them and say, well, we could never commit to 50%, but maybe 10% of the rental, or if you're not happy with that, we'll offer you 7% of turnover, which is the best way to judge if your center is being effective and if we're being effective in luring people back into the center and to our businesses. Peter says, 4th month back to normal rental agreement might be too soon. Peter, so it's quite possible, particularly in the restaurant business, that you have to revise any offer that you've put to your landlord because of the president's announcement last night, which you will be able to do because you haven't signed anything. You might need to go back to 6 months to a year. There's no argument about that. But you have to start somewhere. You have to dig, put your stake in the ground, as they say. Okay. I have spoken about force majeure and supervening impossibility. Supervening impossibility is the term that you would need to be raising if this matter ever goes to the courts. It is a commercial indication of an act of God, whereas force majeure is something like an act of God which results in a pandemic that you ordinarily would want to put into a lease agreement in your favor. But you've either not been allowed to, or no one has advised you to do that. All right, before I move off of leases and your relationship with your landlord, any questions, ladies and gentlemen? Jamil says, those of us in the luxury market, goods, will find it much more challenging to get back to the normal trade. Jamil, you've got two problems here. Number one, where you're going to get your product from. You might have lots of stock, but ordinarily where you're going to get your product from to sell into the luxury market. Number two, how are you going to get that luxury market back? And there the answer is to go online as opposed to expect them to come and fetch their handbag, for argument's sake. And number three is you're most probably also very dependent on the tourism market. Tourism market doesn't exist in this country. tourism market is not going to exist in this country till at least October, November, maybe even next year only. Because even if the flights are opened back to South Africa, the fact that South Africa hasn't yet hit its peak of contractions and deaths. I mean, think about it. If there are now 1 million people who have tested positive in America, and there are 50,000 people who've died, and there are only 3 million people who've tested positive in South Africa, that was America, but there are only 3 million people who've tested positive in South Africa, of whom there are only 50 or 60 or 70 odd deaths. Think how far we are from our curve in South Africa with a population of 58 million people. Now, that is what's going to cause tourists not to want to flock back to South Africa. So, Jamil, your reasoning to have to renegotiate your lease with your landlord is imminent. It's here. You have to do it now. You are a business in distress, and your distress is not going to disappear overnight, even if tomorrow the Minister of Trade and Industry says you can now buy luxury handbags from Jamil. Who's going to want to do that? You see, that's your problem. That's your challenge. Any questions about leases before I carry on?
Yes, Ivor.
Yes, please. Thank you.
You can hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Ivor, just checking, what's the chances of all tenants in South Africa getting together and cancelling all leases and starting fresh with a renegotiation platform like a company like yours? I mean, do we have that kind of power? Would it be possible?
So it's a class action. And I've already considered it. I've already not briefed attorneys, but I've done pre-briefing activities with a set of attorneys. I think I've told you all about it. It's a class action, and the class action would be based on applying the notion of supervening impossibility and of making the neutralization of force majeure an illegal action in South Africa. Because, as I say, there are a number of you who've signed lease agreements where you've invalidated force majeure, which makes it very difficult from a legal perspective. So it would be a subject of a class action, number one, to force landlords into a situation where they needed to renegotiate the leases, and then for SITA to sit down and say, right, we've got a template for leases. We want to see all of the following things in leases. And don't force us to go to government and try to get them to change the law, because we will. We'll go to government and force them to change the law. But the bottom line is we would far rather do it with the landlord associations, that's SAPOA, that's SA Rights, the South African Shopping Centre owners, rather than having to go to the Trade and Industry Portfolio Committee and force them to make law. They will make law because it's a politically correct and popular thing to do, and they always want to be politically popular and correct. But it just will take longer. So, Peter, in answer to your question, that's how we would handle that action. And it very much depends on the next 2 weeks of how landlords react to our applications to them on behalf of by now, as I say, we've done 200 so far. In total, there are 700 tenants we're representing. But how those landlords are going to respond to those tenants in terms of the claim, the requests for some kind of aid and some kind of relief.
Look, I feel that's the only way forward. That's the only way forward for the country. If you want to level the playing field a bit, put a bit more power into the tenants' hands, more profitability, move that profitability to employees in your business and grow jobs that way. That's the way to go. And all tenants would stand together and do this. That will be the only way to go for the future of any business. And looking into the past 2 years of the economy and the recession we've had, if we need to level the playing field with all landlords in this country, and the time to do it is now. There's no other time. If everybody wants to get together, this is the time to do it. So we need a company like you to represent us, to do this kind of thing.
Yeah. All right, moving on.
Hi, sorry, Alistair speaking.
Yes, Alistair, hi.
I spoke to 5 landlords today because I thought, let me just, instead of writing emails to them, let me rather speak to them and find out what their views are. All of them have basically said to me that the offers that have been sent out prior to today were based on us all going back on the 1st of May. They've basically all now said that those offers are a waste of time. They're actually stopping sending out offers now because they don't know what the future holds. So, I said to them that isn't a percentage of turnover the way to go for? They said that is the way that it's looking. They are so desperate for any form of money coming in at the moment that they said, a goodwill payment of any amount is most welcome. And any tenant who has not paid rates, water, utilities, they look at those people in a bad light. But anyone who has paid something, they've almost split the category in half. So the recommendation is to pay anything that you possibly can, plus a goodwill payment. And then they are willing to work with those people. But they've realized that a percentage, because I said, for argument's sake, if we go back on the 15th of May and I turn 100 grand, I've got 3 people I need to pay. I need to pay a bit of a landlord, a bit of my staff, and my suppliers. What I've turned. And they said that even if you pay 5, 6, 7, 8% of turnover, they will take it in the interim because they're looking at building relationships now. The big problem that they've got is that with the Fashini groups and Pepcor's not paying, they're going to eat into any money that us smaller people, were hoping to. The whole PI property industry group document was to protect the smaller people, but with the main guys, saying that they're not paying, that's going to hurt us in the long term. So they say that's going to arbitration because they need to sort that out so they can protect us. But a percentage of turnover is the way that they're all starting to look at.
So, Alistair, thank you for that, sir. So, as you know, what SITA, the South African Independent Tenants Association, have said to our members is this: we're going to give you 4 options. You're going to pay, either you're going to offer to pay 10% of rent, and then for the recovery period, and many of you have extended the recovery period to 6 months as opposed to 3 months. For the recovery period, we'll offer you 7% or 10% of turnover. And the maximum lease extension we might offer you then is a month for a month. So whatever month we've got relief for, we will extend our lease with no escalation for the same period of time. Because many landlords have written and said, well, if we give you a month's worth of concessions, whatever the concessions are, we need you to sign a full year's lease so we can recover those concessions, which is absolute ridiculous. So we've gone back and said, no, rather month for month. So we've offered 4 offers. One is rent with a staggered percentage of rent over 3 months for the recovery period. The other is 10% rent with a percentage of turnover for the recovery period. The other is no rent whatsoever because we just can't afford to pay. And then either a staggered percentage of our rent over 3 months or a percentage of turnover over 3 months. The majority of companies that have asked us to act on their individual behalf have done so asking to say 10% rent is what we're tendering in goodwill, because if you say it's storage, then it's not worth more than 10% to us, 10% of rent, and then importantly, 10% of turnover where we make turnover for the next 3 to 6 months. So that's what's happening. So thank you very much for that. And I quite agree with you. Now is the right time to have those discussions with your landlords, Alistair. But the reality is as well, there's some landlords, particularly the corporate landlords, that are digging their heels in because they really, I think on the one hand, they don't know what to do. On the other hand, they really are convinced that down the line, with penalties and interest, they will succeed in a court of law. And I'm not that confident on their behalf. Okay, all right. So let's move off of this because we do have other considerations to think about. So now I want to talk about your financial considerations as a small business in distress. Well, first of all, I don't know how many of you heard the Maya French video that I circulated a couple of weeks ago and I continue to circulate. But what she's saying to you is forget about business interruption insurance because your insurance companies and your business insurance brokers have managed to wiggle out of that to some extent, although I think there's a day of reckoning coming both for, I would not want to be an insurance broker once lockdown is lifted and there's a little bit of light legally to focus on insurance brokers and insurance companies. I think they are going to turn out to be the criminals of this pandemic. And I think that they're going to have to dip heavily into their personal reserves and their corporate reserves to pay fines and penalties and damages back to you, the people that took insurance out unknowingly in such a way that they misled you. But that's down the line and it's simply conjecture. So forget about business interruption insurance. Very few of you, if any of you, are going to succeed in that claim. Focus more on credit insurance for credit facilities. So where you have gone to a bank and said, I want an overdraft, and they've given you an overdraft, and then you've activated, you using the overdraft. That bank has automatically had to have taken out credit insurance should you be in a position where you're retrenched or having to default. So you would be covered by that credit insurance. Now, you need to ask the bank about the credit insurance. And unfortunately, most of the banks, Standard Bank, First National Bank, you physically can't get to anybody. But eventually, after a lot of trying, you will get to somebody. And that physical person has to give you an answer, not a call center. The physical person has to give you an answer on how you apply for the credit insurance. Not can I apply for the credit insurance? How do I apply? Where's the form to apply? If they say we do not know of this, there's no such thing in First National Bank or Standard Bank or Nedbank, you immediately go to the banking regulator, the banking ombudsman, and you lay an immediate complaint against your bank for not having taken out credit insurance on any credit facility they might have given you. Their only out as a bank is that sometimes, especially if it's a bond, they will have said to you, if you've got your own credit insurance, you don't need to take our credit insurance out. So if you insisted then on taking your own credit insurance out and not the bank's, that's when the bank can turn around and say, here's the form where you said you didn't want the credit insurance. That's why we didn't take it out on your behalf. But if you were never given that choice, or the bank just made the decision on your behalf, or just added the cost of that credit insurance to your monthly repayments on that credit facility, then you are covered. And you need to know that, because for all of your overdraft, for all of your credit card debt, for all of your bonds, repayments, or your car leases, there is credit insurance which goes along. And force majeure very definitely would apply with that credit insurance. Before I carry on, any questions in that regard? George? No, you didn't want to ask anything. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, the next point is this. The Banking Council has urged banks to defer your repayments for the period of the lockdown. The majority of banks have said we'll allow that to happen. The majority of banks have also said we won't incur penalties, but we will incur interest. Some banks have said we won't even charge interest. Basically, every single bank, I cannot think of any that has said no. If you go in and you say, I need my repayments deferred until after lockdown, and by the way, I'm in the restaurant business, so I don't know when lockdown is going to end. The banks, I don't want to say have to, but they have to defer those payments. And you shouldn't let that one go. So at least you've got a certain amount of breathing space as far as those bank repayments are concerned for the period of the lockdown. Over the last, I'd say 12 hours, I actually counted this morning, I was up to 12, but most probably 18. I've most probably had 18 discussions in the course of today with companies that are saying we have to shut our doors. We're insolvent. And I've said to them, put yourself under debt management before you put yourself under insolvency. Because the purpose of debt management, debt counseling, is that a debt counselor, and in fact, the call center industry was declared an essential service so that debt counseling could continue. Where the moment you put yourself under debt counseling, your debt counselor is obliged to engage then with your debtors, the people you owe money to, so that you are in a position to have your repayments to them renegotiated logically. And logically here would be, when I'm making income, I can make payment to you. So before you put yourself into insolvency, which is it's a totally understandable place to go, particularly if you were a restaurant, I would say. But before you put yourself into insolvency, consider putting yourself under debt management. And in fact, most of the time now, the courts will not allow you to declare yourself insolvent until you've been in debt management and they have a report from a debt counselor about the fact that your debts are irrecoverable or unpayable. So the purpose of today's workshop was to hit the ugly truth. This is the ugly truth. If you feel unable to carry on, before you put yourself into insolvency, where the consequence of insolvency is that you will have a 5-year mark against your name. Not that that should stop you from doing it, because there is immediate relief and benefit from being insolvent. It's like a massive weight off of your shoulder. But before you do that, think about debt management. If you take the view that you can trade out of this problem because in your mind, you believe that there's a finite period to lockdown and you can see the other side of lockdown. I know this is an unpalatable discussion. I do apologize for raising it, but that's really the purpose of this workshop. So any questions, any comments about debt management or insolvency, ladies and gentlemen? It is really the simplest way of relieving yourself of your current pressure, I must tell you.
Yeah. Just quickly, it's Elton here again. So if you're looking down the insolvency route or the debt management route, I mean, what is the overall state of restaurants as a whole, or anybody in that hospitality space? Is there a chance of surviving this, or are we delaying the inevitable collapse of a business, of an industry over the next year or two? You know, there's one thing I've learned in business: if you're going to fail fast. There's no point trying to prolong something where there is no longevity. I mean, short term.
So Elton, let me answer.
We can consider short term 6 months. Yeah.
Let me answer your question this way. Sorry to interrupt, but let me answer your question this way. If you have the view that a debt counselor could get you an agreement with people you owe money to for 20 or 30 or 40 cents on the rand, and that you have a way of paying 20 cents on a rand or 30 cents on a rand, but you have no way of paying 100 cents on a rand, then the benefit of going debt counseling to close your business down is better than going insolvent to close your business down. Okay, so let's be honest about that. Insolvency ramifications is that, well, the question is, who's going to be insolvent? If it's a business, then the business goes into insolvency, and if you haven't signed surety, then you can open again tomorrow. I mean, they're multi-billionaires around the world, including Donald Trump, who learned that lesson. And by the way, Donald Trump bought himself a 9-year tax-free holiday with SARS by going insolvent. So for 9 years, he didn't have to pay tax because of that. All right? So in answer to your question, there are some instances where insolvency is very useful. Debt counseling, by the way, doesn't buy you a tax holiday, whereas insolvency would buy you a tax holiday, unless under debt counseling you close your business down. So the point I'm trying to make to you is, if you're going to close your business down, consider debt management or insolvency. Debt management is what you do if you take a view to the fact that down the line there's a chance that you could keep your business going. So I'm going to use a practical example, a Nando's, for example. A Nando's that has a takeaway section and then a sit-down section. If it's split 50-50, takeaway versus sit-down, then Nando's would say, the moment takeaway opens, which will be sooner than restaurant, I can re-gear my business to 100% takeaway. And in the process, I can reduce my costs and I can keep my head above water. But not all businesses have a takeaway and would have to develop the takeaway option and the online option. So it's an art, not a science, how you balance insolvency versus debt management. But you can use debt management to close your business down. It doesn't necessarily need to be insolvent. But the debt manager would also tell you when you should declare insolvency, because a debt counselor would say to you, by declaring insolvency, you buy yourself a tax holiday. So rather go insolvent. But you know, there are also very, very much negatives to insolvency as well. So you just have to balance those two factors. But thank you for raising that point. I do appreciate it.
No, there I agree. One of my things was, so the landlord, you go into it, you look at paying a penalty or 10, 20 cents to the rand, whatever you can afford in it. The other point is around 18 months to 2 years, there's going to be no business as normal. Rather take the hard pain now than try and trade through something and make deals and plans where you could just land up with a bigger hole. If that makes sense. Because consumer confidence and life as we know it I don't think is going to be the same for a while. And for a restaurant that was used to those revenues, our customer bases that we had also don't have an income because they're either laid off or they don't have jobs or they're saving their money for the necessities that they need out of life. I'm just looking at a bit longer forward thinking than 3 months. If I look at the volume of retrenchments going on corporate everywhere.
So you're right. I cannot argue with you. All right. So just moving. Sorry, I cannot argue with you, and I'm certainly not discounting what you say at all. All right. So just moving on, ladies and gentlemen. Again, I'm going to emphasize the fact that we are going to circulate. I wanted to do it before today, before this meeting, but it was impossible. We're going to circulate a questionnaire so that we can start giving input to the Department of Trade and Industry, maybe tourism and hospitality, if they call for that kind of input. The president called for that input yesterday, by the way. So if you can give us the kind of information on the basis of what you can give us, if we can get it from the majority of the industry, we can try and have a lobbying effect on government policy. Now, let's just talk about your obligations to your staff. During lockdown, the UIF temporary employment relief scheme will be available to you as an employer. Essentially, you should also be expecting your staff to encash their leave at this time, but giving them a choice. Either the balance of what we get from UIF TER and what we have to pay you, either you'll forfeit that balance and you can keep your leave, or you encash your leave so we can pay you out your full salary, if you've got enough leave for us to pay you out the full salary. But essentially, you have to apply. And I know many of you are loyal to your staff, and I've read of these crowdfunding initiatives, which are beautiful, and I fully understand where they come from. But as a business person, I'm saying to you, you have to, in your mind, apply the principle of no work, no pay. Your staff don't deserve this, of course, but neither do you deserve to have to be the one to do the paying. So unfortunately, it is no work, no pay. It's that simple. We will pay you, but we'll only pay you UIF TER that we anticipate getting if we're going to be a good employer, or wait for the UIF TER to come in and then pay you. And then we'll pay you the value of the leave that you haven't used previously. We'll allow you to encash your leave. But we're not going to pay you as an employee of the business because we're locked down or while we're locked down. Unfortunately, there's no chance of that. So again, I'm going to say to you, because there are many employers making a mistake and doing the wrong thing now. They're saying, don't worry about take leave. We're going to pay you your full salary. We want you to like us. You don't make that decision as a CEO of a business. No work, no pay. However, there is relief. We paid UIF, which is an insurance policy on your behalf. We can get UIF TER for you. So we will get UIF TER for you. And if there's leave available to you, we'll allow you to encash your leave. But outside of that, no work, no pay. Now, before I go on to the rest of UIF, is there any question about that? Because I know there are a lot of employers who say, you're such a hard so-and-so. How can you expect us not to pay these employees? My answer is, if you've got the reserves and you're happy to pay out of your own pocket, then do it. But it's a bad business decision. Because what happens in May? What happens in June? What happens if this thing carries on for 6 months before you open up again? You've set the precedent of dipping into your own capital. You've set the expectation. Any points or questions about this? I know many of you feel that I'm completely wrong. All right, let's move on.
Ivor,
Yes,
if Ernie, yeah.
Yes, sir.
I totally agree with you. I'm in the same space as you. I'm a management consultant. And people need to bear in mind is that everybody needs to carry a portion of the hard times. So taking a hard stance just on your landlords, but you're being very supportive to your staff, which is good. But the financial burden you're placing on yourself going forward is just so big.
It's unsustainable.
And unsustainable. And people need to bear that in mind, you know. There's lots of business owners, you know, as much as there's UIF for your staff and stuff, but the actual financial support to business owners as such, it's very minimal at this point. People think because you're a business owner, you've got
unlimited resources of cash flow. People might have built up assets and stuff, but that doesn't mean you've got money in the bank. And there's many businesses that's got that problem. It's a cash flow issue, and people need to bear that in mind. I know it's difficult, but sometimes people need to support each other, and staff also need to be aware of that. And I think many of my clients has got that same issue. Very difficult. It's the only point I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. Ladies and gentlemen, I do want to say this to you as well, and this will most probably come back to bear with your landlord. One of your arguments with your landlord is, and it's a bit of they're hypocritical in some respects, and let me explain what I'm trying to say. In the PIGS agreement, the property industry group agreement that most of your landlords are relying on, they make a very big point about not retrenching your staff and treating your staff fairly because they're trying to pander to government and to the trade unions, whatever it is. So they make that point. But then they say to you, you must pay us first. Now, the reality is, you can't, on the one hand, tell me to take care of my staff and then tell me I've got to pay you first, particularly when you realize that the law says that my employees are preferential creditors of mine. Before I pay my suppliers, before I pay my landlord, I pay my employees. So if I've only got enough money to pay my employees, I pay my employees before I pay my suppliers or before I pay my landlord. So you have to understand that. However, if you do not apply the principle of no work, no pay, then you've set a precedent which is unsustainable in your business. So it really is unfortunately an art, not a science. And I hate to sound so blasé, but I have to sound blasé. All right, let's move on. So remembering that the UIF is it's insurance cover for a set of insurance policies. Now, you need to understand this. It's not one policy. So you pay UIF on behalf of Ernie, but you pay it for sick leave. You pay it for short time, where you put your staff member on short time, and it's to fund the difference between what his normal salary is and what you've actually paid him. And then you pay it for UIF TER, which is a new innovation. UIF TER, because you've locked your business down and your employees have been temporarily laid off, is the only UIF policy where the company applies on behalf of the employee. All of the other UIF cover, and there's a whole bevy of UIF cover that you take insurance out for. All the other UIF cover, the employee has to apply to UIF directly with a letter from you, with a supporting documentation from you as the employer. So you need to know this, because in the instance where you've not locked your business down because you're essential services or part essential services, but where you have said to a guy, sorry, for every 8 hours a day you normally work for me, I only need you for 4 hours, so I'm only going to pay you for 4 hours for a variety of reasons. That employee in his own right is entitled to go along with his UIF number to the UIF and say, I want to claim the percentage which I'm entitled to of the difference between what my employer is paying me and what I ordinarily earn for a full day. And the same sliding scale as TER would apply, 60% at the lower level and 38% at the higher level. So you need to know that. And there are a number of companies who have staff in that position. I spoke to a company this morning that's got a sales team, and the sales team can't get out on the road. So they're spending 2 or 3 hours a day actually telephonically phoning clients that they've got personal numbers for and trying to keep orders going, because an element of the business is essential services. So they've been reduced from 8 hours of pay a day down to, forget about commission, but from 8 hours of pay a day to 4 hours, let's say. They're entitled to go to the UIF in their own right and say, we want compensation for the 4 hours that we've lost. And the UIF have a formula for how much they would pay and for how long they would pay, based on for how many months they've received payment on that person's behalf. Okay, I just want to quickly see the questions that have come in. Lee says, sorry to add that the other staff member who earns 15,000 is also taking close to 3,500 because they're working on its scaling system. Makes no sense. All right, so Lee, let me answer your question, because you talk about two people. I don't understand why either of the people you mention would not have had the 38% of the 17,720 Rand applied, which is 6,850. So in both of your, so Lee asks a question. She says the UIF TER is bad, is not paying out what they've said they would pay out. Remembering they said they would start with 100% of someone who earns 3,500 Rand, and then from 3,500 and 1,000 Rand upwards, there would be a sliding scale from 60% all the way through to 38% at 17,720 Rand that would be applied. So anyone earning more than 17,720 Rand would ordinarily be entitled to 6,850, not 3,500 Rand, Lee. So you're entitled to send an email back to them and to say, in terms of your own rules, this doesn't make sense. In both of those cases. Thanks for that question. Louis says, is it mandatory to pay or belong to the bargaining council for the UIF to pay out? Well, you don't pay UIF to the bargaining council, but there are two bargaining councils that the UIF have entered into an agreement with, where instead of companies in that bargaining council then going to the UIF for the UIF TER payment, they would go to the bargaining council for the TER payment. Is it mandatory to pay or belong to a bargaining council? Well, so there are two kinds of bargaining councils. The one kind is a voluntary bargaining council, where you are either party to the bargaining council, which means you belong to an employer association, which is part of the bargaining council, or not. But the other kind of bargaining council is where a voluntary bargaining council has asked the Minister of Labour to extend the bargaining council agreement to cover non-parties that don't belong to the bargaining council employer associations that play in the bargaining council. And if the agreement is extended by the Minister of Labour, then the provisions in that bargaining council agreement apply to all companies, not just those that belong to the bargaining council. I hope that to some extent answers your question, Louis. I hope it does. I don't think it did, but I hope it does. So Alistair says about the UIF TER, strangely enough, they are paying out 35 days at the moment and not 30 days. In other words, they're paying out the section from March, which was part of the lockdown as well. So Alistair has a good story to tell about UIF. Lee, something's wrong with your application. And it would certainly. Now, Alison says, any intel as why foreigners are not being paid? Well, I have it now on good authority, and I'm just going to quickly read the message from those of you who've been listening to me will know that I have a very, very good person who's been running around and in fact did our last webinar for us on the UIF TER. She's been holding out literally for hours and hours and hours to talk to the call center, the UIF call center. And I'm just quickly going to the email she sent me because she was on with them again this morning. And I want just to read to you, ladies and gentlemen, what she said to me in that particular regard. So let me just quickly look up. Sorry, I'm just quickly looking up. I'm looking for her email because it is critically important to read you what she says. Oh, here we go. Okay. So, always do not quote, but we have it on authority from the UIF that they are going to bring out another process for foreigners in the next round. So, unfortunately, you're in a situation where you've been paying UIF on behalf of Zimbabwean people who work for you, and you found that the UIF system has been rejecting your application for those people, and yet you paid UIF for them. And there is no exclusion. There has been no exclusion whatsoever against these people being covered for the UIF TER. It's nowhere in the Gazette. It's nowhere in any of the documents. So those companies have had those applications rejected. So apparently now the UIF is going to deal with that as a separate section of the application process for foreign staff members. So we hope that they'll sort that out. All right, so let's just move on because we are going to run significantly out of time. Ladies and gentlemen, I do want to say this to you. You have to focus, even if it's only in your mind, but preferably in writing. You have to focus on a staff retention policy. You have to know that if there is any chance of your opening up again, you're going to want the good staff members. You're going to want that chef or that cook or that fryer or that front of house who knows their job well. And so you're going to have to figure out what you're going to do in terms of sweetening the pot now to keep them on side for when you open again. It's an art, not a science, and very often it's going to have to be something you might even consider doing off the books. But you have to do it. Protect the staff who are going to protect and rebuild your business. As far as customer relationships are concerned, the only asset you have in your business is your database. You have to be communicating with your customers online, through social media. You have to have a social media strategy in place that's working, where your customers can be communicating back with you. Maybe you should be resorting to doing surveys amongst your customers in terms of products and services that they're prepared to buy online from you, or eventually in a takeaway from you because of the nature of your product or service. You have to find that formula for engaging online. Now's not the time to be so depressed that you become catatonic. And the only thing you can do is retain your asset, which is your customer relationship. It's more important than any of the other relationships we've spoken about so far. I want to come now to the second last thing I want to chat to you about, and that's this. There is talk, in fact, there is action on wanting to bring a Public Administration Justice Act, collective action against the Department of Tourism and Hospitality, the Department of Trade and Industry, and definitely the Small Micro Enterprise. There's only two M's, the Small Micro Enterprise Department. A class action of companies that have been prevented from having access to the benefits that have been released by the Department of Tourism, by the Small Micro Enterprise Department, but essentially orchestrated by the Department of Trade and Industry. Because they have applied triple BEE and transformation, the SMME department and the Tourism and Hospitality department, and there's no question that they've applied transformation at the wrong time. They've applied it at a time that all of those incentives should be available to any company which is being paying tax in this country. And so there is a class action that is brewing. I mean, if you consider that small businesses were entitled to a 50,000 Rand payout under the tourism scheme that was launched by the Department of Trade and Industry and the Department of Tourism a week and a half ago. And yet the minister decided to make a condition of qualifying for that payout the highest transformation level of EME exemption, exempt micro enterprise exemption, which is levels 1 and level 2 as an EME. And so the traditional white business that happened to have a level 4 EME exemption basically didn't qualify because of the number of level 1s and 2s EME businesses standing in line for that 50,000 Rand per company grant. That was, and this goes for restaurants, it goes for hotels, it goes for any business in the hospitality and tourism space. Now that 50,000 Rand could have kept you going for a little bit of time. And yet if you weren't a level 1 or 2 EME business, you stood very little chance of receiving that 50,000 Rand grant. I don't know, maybe I stand open to correction. Maybe there's someone even on this line who received the 50,000 Rand. I don't want to say applied, I want to say received. If there is, could you tell us? All right, so it doesn't seem to be. So the point is that there is a class action brewing against these three government departments to force them to stop applying triple BEE when it comes to who should qualify for grants for aid and for relief in the time of COVID to businesses in distress. It's only going to be successful if small businesses put up their hands and say, we will join that class action. Because otherwise there will be no class action. And so government departments will continue to be able to use your tax money to essentially decimate your part of the industry and sector and allow a whole new group of companies to be created to replace your businesses. I cannot emphasize this point enough. And there just seems to be total apathy, a lack of activation amongst businesses, small businesses in this country. Maybe there's a reason for it. Maybe your restaurant association have said, don't stir the apple, don't upset the apple cart because we're trying to negotiate something else, which I would understand. That's an issue of timing, not an issue of are we going to do it or not do it. But as far as I can see, there's no activation amongst small restaurants. There's no activation amongst small retailers. There's no activation amongst beauty, hair, and hairdressing and nail consultant businesses or personal care businesses. There's no activation whatsoever to make these things a reality. So the billions of rands of aid and relief that's being created is flowing directly away from the hands of at least 50% of the tax-paying businesses in this country. And there's no activation or agitation to stop that from happening. Any comments in that regard? Because it is very, very worrying. Okay.
All right, Ivor, it's Dale here.
Hello, Dale.
Yeah, hi. I do believe that if we had somebody such as your organization that would make this class action visible and make it known to the small business community, that they would rally around it. One of the things that would prevent them from getting involved is they fear high-priced lawyers coming after us in a weakened situation to demand high legal fees to put this action in place. Perhaps the way to do this is to work on a contingency basis.
I hear you. I hear you completely. We've had a question here from Louis Mateza, who says, but why is transformation such a swear word? Louis, in the ordinary course of events, in the normal economy, where a percentage of income and a percentage of the fiscus in that normal economy can be used to incentivize transformation, there is no question that transformation should be a priority. But in an economy under distress, where the majority of people who are employed out there in the marketplace, who are people of color, of those people who happen to be employed in white businesses, where those white businesses are precluded from having access to grants in aid and grants in relief to keep their head above water, to continue employing those people at a time of a crisis, at the time that the country is in this desperate state of disaster, to apply transformation to marginalize and distinguish between one group of companies as opposed to another group of companies is criminal, and it's fraudulent, because the money coming for those incentives come out of the tax base and the tax system that every single company pays tax into, and not just transformation beneficiaries. In fact, the minority of our tax base in this country has been created by transformed companies. And the majority are still those companies that are now not qualifying for any of this aid and any of this relief. You don't see a problem with that. Now's not the time to debate it, but it's certainly the time to raise it. Anyway, let's move on, because it wasn't an issue about transformation or not transformation. But not to see the problem, I believe, is extremely disingenuous and short-sighted. All right. So the final point is...
I couldn't agree more. Ernie, again, is that pandemic doesn't choose color. Transformation at this point should not even be on the table. Should be the survival of a sector and the industry. Point.
Okay, thank you, Ernie. There is a comment from Louis Mateza that says, I think we should have this conversation offline. No, Louis, I don't want to have this conversation, because this conversation needs to happen amongst the disenfranchised, currently persecuted component of the business sector and community out there, not to try and rationalize them to accept their fate, but for them to be able to agitate for this thing to be declared fraudulent the way it stands at the moment. So no, I don't want to have this conversation off air. Thank you for the offer, though. All right, so coming to the final slide, ladies and gentlemen, and that is this, the notion of innovation and pivoting. Now, some of you might have seen, I passed on 2 articles I received this morning, specifically for the restaurant sector. 2 articles I received this morning from the American hospitality sector, which spoke about what you have to do to start reimagining your business and repositioning your business. You have to start understanding that you have to reinvent yourself, and that there is a certain amount of funding which you could lay claim to through business partners and the Department of Trade and Industry ordinarily for this kind of reinvention to be taking place, if they were applying equitable criteria to who receives that funding. So, for example, people want to eat. People want to be treated. People want to live in extraordinary places, even for a short while. If you are able to think about your business in that context, then maybe you can be redesigning your business. As long as you have access to the kinds of people, unfortunately, most of whom will be in nappies still because those are the people who have the skills, but the kinds of people who can suddenly start designing those spaces for you online where you can help people get to eat, where you can treat them even if it's on a distance basis, and where you can help them live in extraordinary places because of the quality of your product as opposed to necessarily only the quality of your service. There is discretionary money for largesse and even excess available. It's still out there in the marketplace. People are prepared to pay a premium. So I'll give you a practical example. If you were in London and the Ritz-Carlton was shut down, but you could order a steak tartare to be delivered via courier to you from the Ritz-Carlton, you would pay a premium. Even if logic says, you know, that premium is like 300% of what I would pay if I was sitting down, it doesn't matter. It depends on the ambiance, the lack of austerity around how you couch and how you create your business and your product offering. And in your business, your restaurants are a business of the mind. They're not a business of reality. It is not a business of nutrition. It's a business of the mind. It's a business of the palate. The question in terms of innovation is, can you recreate the mind, what goes on in the mind, what goes on in the palate, without necessarily the physical presence in a restaurant? That's pivoting. There are some takeaways that are not going to succeed in Johannesburg, even when takeaways are allowed to operate. And those are going to be the takeaways, unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, that put out the same rubbish that they were putting out before COVID-19. Because the quality of takeaways is going to replace the notion of food trucks, which is high-end food, but from a completely different place. Takeaways are going to replace food trucks very much in that kind of model and concept. Something for you to consider if you read these articles. The other thing you want to consider as a group of restaurants is that even as a group of nail salons or hairdressing salons, is that collective action creates economy of scale possibilities. Your overheads and your costs go down with a number of companies agreeing to create a larger business in terms of mergers and acquisitions, or even in terms of equitable shares of a bigger pool or a smaller pool. So the notion of creating economies of scale between your businesses, something critically important to understand. So for example, in America, you would go into a food hall where there would be a deli, but there would also be a fresh food where you could buy fresh meat or fresh fish, then a sit down. If you think about move and pick in Switzerland, that's how they operate. Those are collectives with common back offices and economies of scale which run through those businesses. And it might be a way of refining and redesigning what your business looks like within the context of the shopping center you've traditionally traded in. Sometimes even take down the walls between your businesses and create larger kinds of operations with common back offices. One thing that they say all over the world about this is that competition creates marketplaces and creates markets. And there's no question that that's true. So where to from here? Where to from here is this. There is a group and there is an individual series of legal consultations which is required. No question about that. As far as industry is concerned, industry research to determine the extent of the short, medium, and long-term impact is absolutely critical. And you will keep getting these questionnaires, and please just, they'll be short, but just keep filling them in, please, because that's information that's necessary to give to the Department of Trade and Industry on your behalf to create the kinds of aid and relief packages you're going to need to survive. And for my clients out there, I'm saying to you, participate in this research, because very often it's this research that is going to determine the value of that aid and relief package that's being created. And then very finally, the formation of a strong collective united front for policy change and accommodation. Create an activist organization, ladies and gentlemen. That's what you have to do to survive. Otherwise, you've got to go into debt counseling and you've got to go into liquidation. And there's no embarrassment about doing that in this day and age. But you have to decide one or the other. We're going to fight to survive, or we're going to close our business down. And I think Ernie or someone said it earlier. You need to know when to fold. As a business person, you need to know when to close your business down, walk away, and try again. So you need to make these decisions about your businesses, and it's not easy. Any questions, any comments?
Hi, I'd just like to thank you for listening to. You've opened my eyes immensely. It's the first time I've listened to you, and yeah, I think your final offer is your final option is the right way to go. It's Peter here. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Hi, it's Marianne.
Yes, Marianne.
Hi, it's Marianne Victor here. I'd like to just get your thoughts. How do you think retail and shopping centers will look going forward?
So
what sort of changes are we going to see?
So I think the bottom line is, and I think Alistair said it, the landlords are going to have to move to a percentage of turnover. There's no question about that in terms of how you afford to remain in a shopping center. But the reality is as well, there's no question about the fact that you're going to see fewer retailers, you're going to see fewer restaurants. And as far as the retailers are concerned, you're going to see far more of a blended model initially, but eventually you might even see far more of a shop front model for retailers, where basically you're renting shop fronts to advertise what your goods look like, but people are actually going to be ordering, buying, and receiving online and through the courier services. Because the one thing you've got to remember that the landlords are going to have to remember as well and bear in mind, and I don't know why the SAPOAs of this world and the SA rights of this world and the shopping center associations of this world are not making it clear to the landlords. But this is critically important for landlords and property owners to understand, is that we are expecting a COVID-19 kind of pandemic to be a standard thing every 5 to 10 years in civil society around the world. That is our reality now. Remembering that COVID-19 is a strand of the coronavirus that we have had at least 4 or 5 iterations of in the past. So the point is, this is the one time that governments around the world have said, let's try a different solution to how we deal with the viruses. Because ordinarily, a virus will take 1 million, maybe 2 million people without anyone knowing it. Whereas at the moment, we're on, what are we on at the moment? We're on roughly, I think we're on less than 200,000, even less, of people in the world who have died so far of this virus. So the bottom line is the strategy in saving lives is working, because by now, without warning people that this virus existed, we would have lost millions of people around the world. That's what's happened previously, and that's always been attributed to the flu. The flu takes 1 million, 2 million, 3 million people a year. This is governments around the world saying we're putting our foot down this time and we're going to try and have a different formula to lose less people. But at what cost? At the cost of the world's economy. I think there are going to be a lot of people that say we can't afford to react every 5 or 10 years the way we've reacted to coronavirus. But in answer to your question, if I was to look into the future, I would say shopping centers will be smaller. Shopping centers will have far more storefronts as demonstration space, or rather, what's the word I'm looking for? As demonstration space. But as far as active working retailers are concerned, they will be back offices, and their principal mechanism of choice will be over the internet, even flower arranging, but certainly all other kinds of produce supply. I buy my medicines online rather than ever going into a pharmacy any longer, and I get a better price and a better discount. I buy my flowers the same way. I buy my electronics the same way. So my answer to you is yes, that's what's going to happen. As far as the restaurant business is concerned, the restaurant is in the business of the fantasy, the mind, the imagination. And so the reality is, if landlords were to prioritize their restaurant businesses instead of deprioritizing them to the large shopping centers, to the large superstores, But if they were to prioritize their restaurant businesses, they would be investing in the part of the shopping center that is going to outlive this virus. Many of you might want to do the Tony Factor thing. And he was a great South African who for many years believed of going in and out of closing businesses down and starting again, et cetera, et cetera. Many of you might be having to sit down and say, okay, the cost of closing my business down, I can either afford it or not afford it. If I can't afford it, I'm going to have to go into some kind of liquidation. But my intention is that as soon as the lockdown is truly over and there's consumer confidence to come into restaurants again, I will be refreshed and in a position, possibly even with a new menu, to come back at that stage. And maybe what I will have done is develop and grow a whole new business online now and be allowing people to taste my new menu now, so that when this thing is finally over and I do open physically in a shopping center, my customers will have tasted my food, and to the extent that they love the food, I will have a captive market that comes back to shop. But this is all conjecture. It's certainly not a science, it's an art. But this is what we should basically be having an innovation forum for the restaurant sector of how these kinds of discussions should take place and what should happen.
Absolutely. And if I can just add to that, I often represent tenants and also a lot of times the landlord. And the landlords are so far from that discussion of turnover rentals in this current market. Like anything, it takes them time to sort of grasp the realization of what's going to happen. But there's a massive disconnect currently between the tenants and the landlord.
Marianka, what you have to understand is it took landlords about 20 years to extricate themselves out of percentage of turnover leases. So that was normally the preferred way of doing a lease. But then what they realized is that because of the fluctuation of the market and the seasonality of the market, more often than not, they weren't collecting what they needed in rents because of the fact that they had a percentage of turnover, and that's why they went to fixed rentals. So it is extremely problematic, no question about that.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. We've gone massively over our time. I mean, we started at 2, it's now 4 o'clock. Thank you to those who've remained on the line. I really appreciate that. This recording will be made available via a link on YouTube. Please, I say again, I'm just going to quickly put up on the slide here. I'm just going to very quickly put up a new slide here where I can just type in. So there is a number. It's 082-880-5316. If you can WhatsApp me on that number with the word small, then I will add you to a specific WhatsApp group that is going to be for small businesses in distress, the restaurant industry, beauty, health, and skincare, and hairdressing industry. And as things get announced tomorrow and more of the stuff unfolds, so we will have an engagement session on that WhatsApp group. It's 082-880-5316. 082-880-5316. And I'm really looking forward to talking to you and engaging with you as a community, because I